All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is chapter 23, The United States and the Cold War. The early part of the Cold War, 1945 to 1953. The Cold War is going to last from the end of the Second World War all the way until 1990-91. The Americans and the Russians are battling for world supremacy. Sometimes the Cold War is going to get hot, fought through other countries like Vietnam and Korea, Afghanistan. There's many countries we'll be talking about where the Americans and the Soviets will be fighting indirectly for the most part. It's this fear of a third world war. It's a arms race between the Americans and the Russians. It's going to touch all aspects of society. The space race, movies will be involved. Um, your consumer life. There's just so many examples of the Cold War. So this is just a quick overview of the beginning of it. We see this picture here. Is this tomorrow? America under communism. Americans are in flames. They're in danger. The American flag is burning away. All part of the propaganda of this Cold War. So after the Second World War, the United States emerges as the clear strongest country in the world. Luckily for the United States, they were protected by two oceans. They didn't see the devastation that the European powers saw, as well as many countries in Asia. The Soviet Union also emerged as very powerful, and they alone were the world's two superpowers. So Britain is going to recede back, and France takes a step back. Germany and Japan will no longer be military powers. And the United States policy is going to be rooted in a policy called containment. All right, the Soviets are going to control Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, and they're not giving those countries up. They're going to install pro communist governments within them. They don't want to be invaded a third time by Germany after suffering horrendous losses in the First and Second World Wars. The Soviet Union was committed to having a buffer zone. So all of these countries in Eastern Europe who are pro communist will stand in the way in case of future German aggression. So the Americans' goal is to contain policy from spreading from where it already has its grasp on. Um, George Kennan, an American diplomat, wrote a long telegram where he warned the United States that because Soviet ideology was a certain way, they will be permanently aggressive and they will try to spread their way of life throughout the world. And the United States was concerned with spreading their own beliefs, so it's an ideological war, this Cold War. It's military. It's so many different facets. Winston Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri, and gave a speech, his very famous Iron Curtain speech, saying how Western Europe had been divided between the communist East and the free West. And the Truman Doctrine the very next year, 1947. Britain was unable to maintain an international role. They could no longer support Greece and Turkey, who were in danger of falling to communism. The United States did not want the Soviet Union to have control of Turkey. It was an access to the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, gateway to the Middle East. So even though these two countries were not democratic regimes, it was okay with America as long as they were not communist. So the United States will provide $400 million in both of those countries' civil wars to stop the communists from winning. And it was successful. So the United States is now taking a permanent responsibility among the world. The Marshall Plan was implemented 1948. George Marshall was the American Secretary of State, and the United States is going to spend $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. Today's money, that's $130 billion. Communism was gaining strength in the West, in France, and in Italy. This represented a new deal for Europe. It's going to allow these countries to recover quickly. America needs trading partners. All of the factories in America are churning out products, and it's useless if you have no one to sell them to. So Europe benefits, Western Europe benefits, the United States benefits as well. Japan is going to be reconstructed, and again, this was America's check on communism over in Asia. Douglas MacArthur will administer the occupation. They'll set up a new democratic constitution, one based on a strong economy, not a strong military. Here is a Dutch pamphlet promoting the Marshall Plan. Without the Marshall Plan, your bread would be bare. and so would your children. So, again, propaganda to get people to buy into the Marshall Plan, and in so doing, buy into democracy as well. Bales of American cotton sent over to the French, 1949, part of the Marshall Plan. Here is that Cold War divide. Here we spoke about with Churchill's Iron Curtain. From the west over, these countries will remain free, except for Spain, which is controlled by fascist Francisco Franco. And these countries in the west will have two Germanys now, an East Germany and a West Germany. They will not be reunited until 1990, 91. All of these countries here will be in the grasp of communists. And Yugoslavia was communist, but they were led by a strong leader named Tito, who was going to break away from the control of the Soviet Union. Um, and then Greece and Turkey were in danger of falling to communism, but the Truman Doctrine saved them. The Soviets are going to try to test President Truman and his containment policy. When it looked like West Germany was going to go into effect and a new currency was being distributed, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, which was a free city in East Germany. Let me go back to the map. Berlin, right here, the western part was controlled by the Americans, the British, and the French. There was complete freedom in here, and it drove the Russians crazy because they could not stop democracy from taking place in this area. The rest of the country and the rest of the city was communist. So the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, and the Berlin airlift was put into place. 11 continuous months where the United States and the Western powers airlifted billions and billions of dollars worth of supplies into the city to save them from starvation. Eventually, the Soviets will lift the blockade, and the West is going to win this Cold War battle. NATO is created, which is a mutual defense pact in the event of Soviet aggression in Europe. So America, Canada, those Western European countries will all pledge to support each other if one of them is attacked by the Soviets and by the communists. The Russians will form their own pact, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955 with their fellow communist countries. 1949, critical year in the Cold War. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb to the surprise of the United States. Only 4 years after we had it, our monopoly is gone. And China is going to become a communist country. A lot of people criticize Truman for losing China, but we never had China in the first place. China becomes communist, so now the largest country in the world, the Soviet Union, and the most populous country, China, are both communists. Children here celebrating the arrival of a plane in the Berlin airlift. And there is the communist leader Mao Zedong, who, if you think Hitler and Stalin were bad, Chairman Mao, under his reign, even more people were killed because of a brutal, oppressive regime. Upwards of 50 million people died under Mao. Another Cold War battle was the Korean War, and here the Cold War got hot. All right, North Korea controlled by the communists, supported by the Russians. South Korea, not communist, also not democratic. When North Korea invaded South Korea, Truman saw this as a Soviet challenge to his policy. So a war broke out. It was a bloody, horrible war. There were components of World War I and World War II fought in Korea. 2 million Korean civilians will die, 1 million Korean soldiers, hundreds of thousands of Chinese who were going to enter the war. It was a horrible war. General MacArthur didn't like fighting a limited war. And when he wanted to push into China to expand the war and stop the Chinese soldiers from entering, his plan was to drop 26 nuclear bombs on the Chinese cities. President Truman didn't want this to turn into World War III. MacArthur criticized him publicly. Truman had no choice but to fire MacArthur. MacArthur came back to America as a national hero. Truman's approval rating dipped to about 20%. Here is a map of North Korea here, divided at the 38th parallel. South Korea is here. And even to this day, there has still not been a formal peace treaty ending this war. An armistice was signed in 1953, but technically the war is still happening. Here's a photograph of a street battle in Seoul, capital of South Korea. So it was successful in the aspect that South Korea did not fall to the communists. Some people criticized Truman for not saving North Korea. Here at home, Truman had a plan similar to Roosevelt's New Deal called the Fair Deal. Um, this plan wanted to raise the minimum wage, have national health care system for all, increase public housing, increase the Social Security and educational aid. However, the Republican Congress blocked the entire thing. Truman was a progressive president in the sense that he wanted to bring about civil rights for African Americans. He established a commission which called on the federal government to end segregation, guarantee equal treatment in housing, employment, education, the criminal justice system. Truman called for anti-lynching bills, anti-poll tax bills. However, none of these things were able to come to fruition for Truman. However, amazing accomplishment, he did desegregate the military. So when the Korean War was fought for the first time, black and white soldiers fought together throughout the war. Civil rights movement is beginning. 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Um, he overcame amazing obstacles, incredible prejudice, not allowed to fight back his first year. Um, and it was a success. Took the Dodgers to the World Series many times, usually losing to the Yankees, but victorious in 1955. 1948 election, we're going to see four candidates. Harry Truman, the Democrat. Republican was Thomas Dewey. Strom Thurmond was the leader of the Dixiecrats, and they are states' rights Democratic Party. Basically, they support segregation. And Henry Wallace, Truman's or messed that up. Roosevelt's former vice president, he led the Progressive Party, who was even more progressive for civil rights and also had a different stance on foreign policy with the Russians. Dewey was favored to win. Even the Chicago newspaper printed Dewey defeats Truman, a very iconic picture. But Truman wins. He crisscrossed the nation by rail, trying to convince voters to vote for him, and it was an upset. Truman was victorious, convincingly won 57% of the vote. Here at home, an anti-communist crusade began. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, is going to hold hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. The Hollywood 10 will be jailed for contempt of Congress. Hollywood's going to blacklist hundreds of people accused of sympathizing with communism or not turning over names. Here's a rally in 1953, Burn All the Reds. Red is a symbol for communism. The spy trials, very famous. Alger Hiss, a State Department official, was accused of giving secret documents to Soviet agents. He served 5 years in prison. Representative Richard Nixon rose to prominence with his dogged pursuit of putting Hiss in jail. The Rosenbergs were a New York City couple. They were communists, convicted of conspiring to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to the Soviets during World War II. At the time, the Soviets were not our enemy, they were our ally. It looks like now Julius Rosenberg did provide some information to the Soviets. His wife was probably completely innocent. Her brother, who worked for the Manhattan Project, said her name instead of using his own wife. Later on, he said, his wife bore him his children, so he owed her more than his sister. Both of them were given the electric chair, 1953. Joseph McCarthy, the ultimate symbol of this anti-communism, he was a Wisconsin senator, lied about his war record to get into the Senate, claimed to have a list of 205 communists who worked at the State Department. No proof at all, never identified a single person that was disloyal. And he was exposed as a fraud in 1954 when he went after the Army. And the president at the time was Dwight Eisenhower, who was the great general of World War II. Condemned by the Senate for his actions, remained powerless until 1957 when he died of alcoholism. Here's an image of McCarthy at the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. So this fear of communism is pervasive. It's going to be throughout the 1950s and 60s. continues into the 70s and the 80s. This Cold War is going to last a long, long time. All right, that concludes Chapter 23, the Cold War.